Imagine building one of the most powerful car companies in the world, making over $32 million, equivalent to hundreds of millions today, only to be forgotten by history. This is the story of two brothers who went from being the poorest kids in town to rivals of Henry Ford, shaping the future of the automotive industry. But why do so few people know their names? Stick around, because the untold story of the Dodge brothers will blow your mind. Imagine being so poor that you couldn't even afford shoes in the winter. That's exactly how John and Horace Dodge grew up in the small town of Niles, Michigan, back in the 1860s. They were the poorest kids in town, often barefoot and wearing ragged clothes. But instead of complaining, they turned their hardships into motivation. These brothers were not just surviving, they were already thinking about a future far bigger than their small-town beginnings. From a young age, John and Horace learned the value of hard work. Their father ran a machine shop, and that's where they spent their days, picking up skills that would later define their lives. But the family business fell apart, forcing them to move around Michigan, from Battle Creek to Port Huron. Still teenagers, they started working alongside their father at the Upton Manufacturing Company. They mastered the trade of machinists, working with iron and steel. But John, the older brother, wasn't satisfied. He knew there was more to life than their small-town gigs. So, with just 50 cents in his pocket, John headed off to Detroit, the industrial heart of America, in 1886. The move was a game changer. John found work at Murphy Iron Works, and soon after, Horace joined him. The brothers were finally together again, making a modest living. But then, disaster struck. John contracted tuberculosis, which at the time was a deadly disease. For months, John was bedridden, and Horace took on extra jobs to support both of them. This struggle didn't defeat them, it only brought them closer. Once John recovered, the brothers decided it was time for a fresh start. They crossed the river into Windsor, Canada, where they worked at the Dominion Typograph Company. This was a big turning point because it was here that they learned specialized precision work that would later help them dominate the automotive industry. But their first big success didn't come from cars, it came from bicycles. Horace invented a 4-point bicycle ball bearing that was dust-proof and gave riders a smoother ride. This invention led to the creation of the Evans and Dodge Bicycle Company in 1897. It was an instant hit, with sales skyrocketing. But as competition in the bicycle industry grew, the brothers decided to move on. In 1900, they returned to Detroit and set up the Dodge Brothers Machine Shop. This was the moment that would change everything. They began building and repairing all kinds of machinery, but their big break came when Ransom Olds, the founder of Oldsmobile, asked them to produce parts for his cars. The Dodge brothers didn't just deliver, they excelled. Their work was so precise and reliable that Oldsmobile's curved dash vehicle became a sensation. This partnership made them wealthy, but it was only the beginning of their empire. Then, in 1903, the real gamble came. A man named Henry Ford approached the brothers, asking them to supply parts for his new automobile company. Now, Ford wasn't the legend he is today. At that point, he had already failed in 2 attempts to start a car company. But the Dodge brothers took a risk. They agreed to supply Ford with 650 sets of running gear for his cars, even though he could barely afford to pay them. The deal they made? Instead of cash, they'd take a 10% ownership in Ford Motor Company. That decision turned out to be brilliant. When Ford launched the Model T in 1908, it took the world by storm. Millions of cars were sold, and by 1914, the Dodge brothers were rolling in money. They weren't just supplying parts, they owned a piece of Ford's success. In fact, 9 out of every 10 cars on the road were Fords, and the Dodge brothers were right at the center of it all. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. The brothers grew tired of working under Henry Ford. Ford was known for his controlling nature and stubbornness. Even though the Dodge brothers gave him advice on how to improve the cars, Ford never listened. So in 1914, after years of success with Ford, John and Horace made a bold move. They decided to launch their own car company, the Dodge Brothers Motor Company. Their first car, the Model 30, was a masterpiece. It had a 35-horsepower engine, which was more powerful than Ford's Model T, and came with features like an all-metal body, electric starter, headlights, and a speedometer. Things Ford's cars didn't have. The Dodge Model 30 was an instant success. In their first year, they sold 45,000 cars, and by 1916, Dodge was the third largest car manufacturer in America. The rivalry between Ford and the Dodge brothers was on. While Ford was busy trying to keep up with Dodge's innovations, the brothers were still making millions from their 10% stake in Ford Motor Company. This drove Henry Ford crazy. He was paying dividends to the Dodge brothers, who were now his biggest competition. Eventually, Ford tried to cut off their earnings by stopping dividend payments, so the Dodge brothers sued him. After a long legal battle, they won, securing more than $2 million in back dividends. But Ford wasn't done. In 1919, he bought out the Dodge brothers' shares for $25 million, making John and Horace even richer. By now, the Dodge brothers were living the high life. They had massive mansions, land yachts, and more money than they ever could have imagined. But while they had achieved incredible success, their personal lives were starting to show cracks. John and Horace were known for their hard drinking, often getting into bar fights and shunning the elite circles of Detroit's high society. Despite their rough-around-the-edges image, they continued to dominate the automotive world. In 1920, the Dodge Brothers Motor Company was the second-largest car manufacturer in the United States, right behind Ford. But just when it seemed like nothing could stop them, tragedy struck. Both brothers fell ill during the flu pandemic that swept across the world. John Dodge passed away in January of 1920, and just 11 months later, Horace followed. They had built an empire, but they didn't live long enough to see it continue to grow. Their company lived on for a time, eventually being sold and becoming part of the Chrysler Corporation. The Dodge brand we know today is a legacy of the incredible innovations and hard work of these two brothers, who went from barefoot kids in Niles to multi-millionaires who shaped the future of the automotive industry. Yet, despite all their success, their names remain overshadowed by Henry Ford. And there you have it, the incredible rise and fall of the Dodge brothers. From humble beginnings as the poorest kids in town to reshaping the entire automotive industry, John and Horace Dodge were true innovators. Their legacy may not be as widely recognized as Henry Ford's, but without them, the cars we drive today might look very different. It's fascinating how two brothers with nothing more than determination, grit, and a passion for machinery could build one of the most successful car companies in history. Yet, despite their massive impact, they remain largely forgotten. What do you think? Do they deserve more recognition for their contributions to the automotive world? It's amazing how some of the most influential figures in history end up in the shadows of the more famous names, right? If this story sparked your curiosity or changed how you see the history of cars, let me know your thoughts.